Welcome to the Eric Brady podcast, Series 1, Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me. Episode 8, Hitler Invades France. So Eric, after being evacuated to Folkestone at the start of the war, you were moved when the British war planners realised that France was vulnerable to invasion because the Maginot Line actually fell short. Can you explain more about that?
The Maginot Line was a very strong line of guns and gun emplacements, of artillery in particular, and also with linked forts right along the length, which the French had built between 1930 and 36, stretching along the French border facing Germany. And it was stopped at the Ardennes forest because it was believed that the German armour would not be able to penetrate that forested and mountainous region. They have made treaties with Holland and Belgium that if Germany did invade them at all through their countries, that they would give permission for the French armies to go onto their soil to defend their borders against Germany. In the event, between the wars, Holland and Belgium suddenly cancelled those treaties, which then left the French vulnerable if the Germans invaded through Holland and Belgium. They therefore tried to extend the Maginot Line as far as the coast, but that section was very much weaker than the genuine, as it were, Maginot Line that was actually on their borders. In the event, following the invasion of Czechoslovakia and then of Poland, it was realised that the Germans had adopted a completely different type of warfare, the warfare of Blitzkrieg.
Blitzkrieg means lightning war. Can you explain what this was and how it came about?
During the First World War, air power had been very limited. It was only just at its beginnings, though it did develop considerably during World War I. However, in the interwar years, the Germans had developed the strategy not only of ground attacks, but with the development also of motor transport and tanks, it had become a very mobile attack. So instead of soldiers advancing on foot or horseback, they would advance with armoured vehicles supporting the infantry. Also, they had so developed their air forces of bombers and fighters and dive bombers like the Stukas that they were able to attack on multi-fronts and very rapidly indeed. And therefore, it was much quicker as an attacking force than World War I had been.
Wasn't this in part informed by Hitler's experience in the trenches and not wanting to repeat that type of warfare?
To a degree, because he knew exactly what trench warfare was like. And so with the development of motor transport and armoured vehicles, he much preferred that to protect his own soldiers, as well as having much greater firepower with the tank shells, etc.
I imagine also trenches were no longer as effective with the development of tanks.
That's right.
So how did Hitler's invasion of France play out?
On the invasion itself, on the 10th of May 1940, the Germans invaded France from three different directions. German Army Group A attacked Holland and on to Belgium, and then the weaker Maginot Line. Army Group B, in fact, attacked through the Ardennes, penetrating the forested region with 1,500 tanks. German Army Group C attacked the Maginot Line, but that was more to pin down French troops there, so weakening the rest of the front, rather than actually trying to batter that almost impregnable area of forts. Having come through the Belgian border, they then were able to penetrate right the way through. This, in fact, was a development of the Schlieffen Plan, which in fact was partly used in World War I. But this was another development of that, and using the Blitzkrieg methods, which had been not used in World War I because it had not been invented at that time.
What was the Schlieffen Plan?
That had been devised well before World War I, and it was the proposal by General Schlieffen, German, to invade France through Holland and Belgium. That was because they had just, as it were, recovered from the War of 1870. The other part of the Schlieffen Plan, in fact, was to attack Russia, which was expected to come in any future war, as indeed happened in World War I initially. However, it was decided that Russia was out of it with an alliance that Hitler made with Stalin before World War II began, and so he could concentrate entirely on the attack on the West, though his ultimate intention, in fact, was to attack Russia. He'd explained that in his book in 1923, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle.
In your book, you explain Hitler's pretext for the invasion of Holland and Belgium. Can you just say a bit more about that?
Yeah, he alleged that because he, quotes, feared that Belgium and Holland would be occupied by the Allies, he would, quote, protect them to ensure their neutrality. Therefore, of course, he just used that as an excuse to invade himself. France surrendered on the 22nd of June 1940, which actually took effect on the 25th of June. Germany occupied Paris, northern France, and also all the Channel ports, which of course were necessary for an invasion of the UK. The French were technically allowed to keep part of the southern part of France, after the Italians had also taken a chunk of France to incorporate it in Italy. Marshal Pétain was appointed as, in effect, Prime Minister of Vichy France, so-called Vichy because it was based in the village of Vichy towards the south of France. But then later he was replaced by Pierre Laval in 1942 because Pétain, it actually was a pretty elderly gentleman. And then the Germans simply occupied all the rest of France.
To buy your copy of Adolf Hitler, His Bombers and Me to read alongside the series, go to ericbradybooks.co.uk. The Eric Brady podcast can be found on YouTube, podcast services, and at ericbrady.blogspot.com.